if you think about it, the system that produces U.S. foreign policy is a really complex and highly institutionalized system that has multiple different actors. You've got Congress, you've got the bureaucracies, you've got the press, the commentariat, and then obviously you have the executive branch. And even, within the executive branch, you have multiple different actors at any one time. And so what struck me, both from my time in government, my time observing from the outside, is that oftentimes when a new president enters the Oval Office, the tendency is to think we can really, do some big stuff here, especially if they've been talking about it or there's pressure from the outside to make changes. But then the reality is that, the president of the United States has extraordinary power, but it's not like the president is the head of a corporation that can easily hire and fire people, restructure, change strategy. It's really far, far more difficult to do because of the way in which these policies are institutionalized. So in this report, we basically talk about what the implications of that are for those who want to make change, which we think is something that people should be trying to figure out how to do. And we talk about how hard it is, but also why it is possible if you get your plan right and you're willing to make the effort.
Mm-hmm. And you identify three elements in particular, I would say, in this report. You talk about bureaucracy, you talk about Congress, you talk about human psychology, if you will. So give us a bit more on that.
Sure, absolutely. People think a lot about Congress, I guess, in a way that may be the most obvious to anyone who hasn't spent a lot of time working in the executive branch itself. But certainly, Congress, even though there's a lot of talk about Congress not having a big role in foreign policy, when it comes to big strategic changes, things that require changes in budgets, statutory changes, Congress actually does have a pretty significant role. So if you're trying to do big things, you need to get cooperation from Congress. And even at times when Congress isn't really, when it's not a strategic change, Congress can put a lot of political pressure on the president, try to box the president in, or prevent the president from doing things that they might otherwise want to do. The bureaucracy is the one that I think is harder to see from the outside, maybe. But the bureaucracies that run U.S. national security, policy, or that implement U.S. national security policy are massive organizations in and of themselves. I mean, they're designed, to at high levels of complexity, and changing them is really, really hard. So when people say that they're going to change a bureaucracy and get them to, pursue different objectives than the ones that they're accustomed to pursuing, we have to be a little bit skeptical about that. And then obviously there's the human psychology dimension to this too, which is that, if you're going to make changes, it requires usually admitting some kind of fault. People do not like to do this. So that's just basic human nature.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah. But and we have all kinds of, incentives that are built into the political economy of the jobs that you and I, enjoy here in Washington that contribute to sort of groupthink, that make change, ideational change, I think, more difficult. And tend to discourage it, so we don't get always the full development of new ideas that we actually really need in a world that's changing, where America's role is going to have to change with it.
Yeah, hold that thought on America's role. We want to talk about that much more. But first, I think in the setup of this conversation, Steve, maybe we can spend some time just illustrating what that bias towards status quo looked like in practice. You and Chris, I think, point out something very powerful in a foreign affairs op-ed that is out this week, which is that both President Trump and President Biden actually sought to make some of the same changes to foreign policy in their presidencies, and I would probably add President Obama to that list as well. They all wanted to pivot to Asia by reducing the U.S. role in the greater Middle East and limiting defense commitments in Europe. There have been modest changes looking at the U.S. role in the war in the Middle East and the balance sheet of transatlantic burden sharing in the Ukraine war. I think it's fair to say that they all three struggled to achieve their objectives. So how do you think about these three factors that Chris has laid out, bureaucracy, Congress, human psychology, affecting the Trump and Biden White House and stalling these two presidencies' efforts to affect change?
Even you can go back to George W. Bush on the campaign trail. He decried how under President Clinton, the United States was engaging in what he called missions without end. So there is this pattern of presidents promising a more restrained foreign policy that focuses on the real challenges of the day and does less to things that seem to matter less. And then they end up having a lot of trouble delivering on that. I think with respect to President Trump, he announced a number of times that U.S. troops were going to withdraw from Syria. They did not withdraw from Syria. He was stifled by his own bureaucracy, which tried to sell him on new rationales for that mission and at least slow-rolled what seemed to be his own orders. In addition, there was a big uproar in Congress that indicated that President Trump would pay a political price, especially if something went wrong, that would be hung around his neck. And U.S. troops remain in Syria to this day. So I think we actually saw all those factors collide in that one example, whereas a place where Trump did make a meaningful change was in pulling out of the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement with Iran. And one reason why he had an easier time doing that is that it was a longstanding goal of the Republican Party to back out of that agreement. There were parts of the bureaucracy that wanted to do that. And so the conditions for making that kind of a change were much more propitious than for doing something that maybe Trump felt in his bones, but few around him were really convinced and bought into that idea. President Biden also came in, especially in his first year, promising to end the war in Afghanistan. They did conduct a global posture review in the Defense Department with a view toward quote-unquote right-sizing the U.S. military posture in the Middle East. Look, Biden did deliver the withdrawal from Afghanistan. He then paid a political price for it. There were bipartisan howls coming from Congress, coming from the media, even though the withdrawal was a policy that was essentially inherited from the Trump administration, and that had strong public support. When people saw it unfold, largely because it was so messy and gruesome, they didn't like what they saw. And so I think that lesson is going to resonate for other presidents who are thinking about, terminating a military mission at least. And they are going to fear that they will be punished politically, maybe thwarted by the bureaucracy, but if they're not thwarted, punished for delivering a change that actually does seem to be in the U.S. national interest, as I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan was.
I want to talk about what U.S. policymakers can do about this. So presumably candidate Harris and candidate Trump are currently planning their presidencies, thinking about how to get around these obstacles. Presumably. So let's talk about the bureaucracy. Chris, so you mentioned the president is not the head of a corporation. One of these candidates, former President Trump, has tried to approach his presidency.
It was clear in how he approached the bureaucracy at the start.
Arguably in that way. And now he still talks about, his approach to getting around bureaucracy is to drain the swamp, getting around the powerful machinery by essentially gutting it.
It's not going to work.
If it is indeed agencies and bureaucracies that have prevented strategic change in the past, isn't that the right approach?
Yeah, no, I don't. I mean, look, every administration that comes in politicizes bureaucracies to a certain degree, but there are real limits to how much you can do of that. Because the fact of the matter is that, again, these are extraordinarily complex organizations, and really only the people who work in them and have made their careers in them know how to make them work. And I'll just point out, they're also absolutely essential to American power. Right? America would have no power if it weren't for the Defense Department, the State Department, the intelligence community, the other bureaucracies that support our foreign policy. So it's really important that they function well. So the idea that, for example, you could just replace all of the cadre of officials who serve in them, it doesn't make sense. You would have bureaucracies that did not work, and that would make America much weaker in the long run. So what you need to do is to go on an influence campaign, basically. If you want to try to persuade the bureaucracy to do things differently, you have to get out there, send senior people from the administration to explain to the bureaucracy what the policy is, why you want to do it. You have to be sensitive to what the interests of that bureaucracy are. For example, if this is going to mean, reducing budgets in some areas, be aware of what those areas are, because that's where you're going to get pushback. If you can make the case in terms of pointing out that not making the change, and this gets to the human psychology question, that not making the change that you want to see is actually going to be extremely costly, that it's going that the bureaucracy will incur a lot of losses of things that matter to it, that's probably going to be a more persuasive argument than a lot of others that you could make. So it's a question of being willing to invest that capital, and this requires a certain amount of trust with bureaucracy, which I think is something that President Trump, at least if he were elected again, could do a better job of in a second term.
So basically, you've just won a mandate from the American people, and now you need to win a mandate from the agencies.
I think that's just the reality.
Yeah.
It's just the reality.
Yeah. All right. So the human psychology and the as a factor that inhibits change, I think, is one of the really crucial elements that you point out in your research. And Stephen, you might argue that anyone arguing against the pursuit of U.S. primacy in world affairs overseas, which is something that, let's remember, all three last presidents have done, for instance, with regard to the Middle East. Anyone who wants to do that encounters this challenge of loss aversion, in that the U.S. doing less, exerting less influence in a region could be felt by the U.S. policymakers who were previously engaged there as a loss. So how do you think about that, and how do you tackle this issue?
So this is a huge challenge. So President Trump has done something interesting in this regard. There's a conventional view in Washington that basically American primacy, American military presence, American alliances, those are all wins. And so if you give any of that up, that is a loss, or it's awfully suspect, and you better have a rock solid argument and be able to show exactly how this is going to work smoothly. Trump has, at least in his public messaging, put forward a way to redefine strength. He always decries his opponents as weak, but when he talks about strength, it doesn't always mean using the military instrument to dominate an adversary. It might mean asserting America's interests against allies, adversaries, whoever. And so that, I think, offers one potential way that, not just Trump or Republicans, but Democrats as well, could think about flipping the logic of, well, actually, what is a win and what is a loss for the United States in the world? Perhaps it's not, making a defense commitment that the United States is ill-equipped to deliver on if it comes to it. That would be one way of putting, an alliance commitment. So I think there are ways of kind of getting past the typical logic and trying to make the case that U.S. interests will be advantaged by a policy that may involve some measure of retrenchment. And I think, to be clear, Donald Trump has been very incomplete, shall we say, in making this kind of argument in a systematic way. U.S. alliance has expanded in his first term, so I don't think he's actually put forward
a difficult symbol of entrenchment.
But he has drawn upon this language at times that I think is remarkable, and I think people noticed that and reacted to that one way or another, whether they're in Washington or the general public. So I point to him as just showing, some way to make a case that is different from conventional wisdom, but perhaps it's not the only way. But one of the techniques that can be used also, as Chris was alluding to, is to harness a psychological trait, which is loss aversion. So on the one hand, the sunk cost fallacy may make people resistant to changing course when the United States has invested so much into a particular enterprise like the war in Afghanistan. On the other hand, people also experience loss aversion, which means that they are less willing to endure a loss than they are to achieve a gain of equal magnitude.
Yeah.
Right. So to take the example of the war in Afghanistan, one could argue to the Defense Department or to the public, yes, we've invested a lot in this long mission, but it is failing. We have no good way to see it come to a successful end, and we should cut our losses and not exhibit further losses, which will also set us back with respect to preparing for major power competition, which will cause more needless casualties, et cetera. And ultimately, I think that argument did win the day, even if the circumstances of the withdrawal proved to be politically unpopular.
Chris, do you agree with that strategy, redefining what a win looks like in order to get around the loss aversion when it comes to declining U.S. influence in the world?
Yeah, I do. I think it's hard to do, as we're sort of struggling with here, but it is one of the things that came out of this study, is in the extent to which, there are all of these losses that they're not they're just costs that we pay for our foreign policy, but they tend to get baked in, right? And people just come to accept them. But I think shining a light on the costs that we are incurring just almost by habit is important, because, what happens is the United States goes around and, over decades has, for usually, not always, but usually pretty good reasons, incurred commitments around the world. But those commitments become very difficult to unravel even when they've outlived their time. But the costs of sustaining them continue. So you have to figure out a way to draw attention to those costs when it's appropriate. It doesn't mean that there aren't commitments that are still worth it, where the costs are worth it. But not every single commitment that the United States has made in the past is going to serve America's interests today, or let alone in 10 or 20 years, at the level of costs that we're incurring from it.
So in your report, Chris, you write that crisis is a great driver and facilitator of change, and that foreign policy leaders should have an idea of how they might use a crisis to open or foreclose opportunities to shift strategy. I think this is a really interesting point. I mean, especially the idea that foreign policy leaders in advance should have an idea of how they use a crisis. You write about this in your report, that there's risk in this approach, that human biases and psychological fallacies affect political leaders, and that's heightened in a crisis, of course, that there's great pressure to act and act fast and act in a way that looks decisive, and that's not necessarily conducive to a disciplined approach to foreign policy making. And now the ideal scenario is perhaps that a brilliant idea existed in the ether for a long time, and now there's a crisis, and policymakers that were previously too blind to see, now their blinkers are off and they will enact your idea. But that is really hard to plan for if you're candidate Harris, if you're candidate Trump right now. So how should policymakers think about this crisis factor when they think about how they want to enact strategic change?
Well, I mean, I think we observed from the case studies that, some of the big changes that the United States has made in its foreign policy simply have happened at times of crisis. And so, when you say that, it sounds almost, common sense, right? Certainly 9/11 is the most recent one that we experienced. But when you start to dig into it, you realize that, the crisis didn't determine the policy that followed, that there was a lot of flex in the system, give in the system, and that policy could have gone in different ways. And there's arguments about the specific 9/11 case in literature that will continue. But, just to sort of take the orthodox story is that, there was a group of neoconservatives in the George W. Bush White House who had notions about how they wanted to reshape the Middle East. And when 9/11 happened, they seized on this opportunity in order to implement their plan. And as a consequence, we had not only the global war on terror, we had a global war on terror that was not limited only to taking out al-Qaeda. It also expanded to a very transformational set of goals in the whole Middle East. So that's an example, if you will, of where there were ideas, a crisis happened, and the ideas that existed before actually did an enormous amount to shape the policy of the United States afterwards. So what we're saying is that when there is a crisis, there is going to be this sort of hinge in the history of American foreign policy, and to the extent possible, take advantage of it.
Yeah, and that it is not predetermined. I think that is probably a good thing to keep in
Absolutely,
mind. Yeah.
And the flip side of that is be careful. If someone is trying to put forward their old idea as the proper response to a crisis, they may have effectively put forward a solution in search of a problem. And so, hey, maybe that is the right answer, but often it isn't. And there are other ways to think about responding to a crisis that might make more sense. So the Iraq War is a good example of that. Even the strategic document NSC 68 in 1950, it was rejected. It had a very muscular approach, a global and militarized approach to waging the Cold War, and President Truman rejected it in the spring of 1950, and then he approved it later that year. Why? Because the Korean War began, and it was seen as confirming the general thrust of NSC 68, that the communist menace was not just focused on Europe, but it was global, and that there was this kind of Kremlin-controlled monolith. Well, that really oversimplifies what led to the Korean War itself and the agency of Koreans north and south in that. But the crisis was used to get a very important strategic concept passed. And so, it's worth thinking about, whatever side of the ledger you're on, how the crisis is being mobilized.
both in the crisis itself and presumably through contingency planning in advance.
One of the things that was interesting to us as we looked at this is that we noted obviously that more often than not, crises actually lead to deeper engagement. And this is simply because, in a crisis situation, there's this enormous pressure to act.
You want to do something. Yeah.
And so that is another thing that, ideally policymakers would be cognizant of and recognize that sometimes actually not acting, or at least not acting right away, may be the best foreign policy option. Whether it's politically possible is, of course, a whole other set of questions.
That's something you can prepare for, to be disciplined in a crisis. All right, so we're going to take a short break now, and coming up next, we're going to talk about whether the next president can make real changes. Now, I want to use this second half of our episode today to really zoom in on some of the major foreign policy challenges that the next U.S. president will face. We know there's going to be additional crises, as discussed, but we know some of these. And I'm going to ask you both to I guess, draw lessons from your research to advise them on how to tackle these. Let's start with Ukraine. Now, Chris, candidate Trump, former President Trump, has said very clearly that he wants the war in Ukraine to end as soon as possible. Kamala Harris does not say that. She has said that she wants to stand by Ukraine and that she wants them to win, but she hasn't defined so far what winning looks like and what thus ending the war would look like. This is an obvious challenge that the next U.S. president is going to face. How do you think your research can help them to tackle that challenge?
Well, one of the fundamental points that we make is that the capacity to make big changes in the direction of U.S. foreign policy depends a lot on how much political capital you have and how much you're willing to spend it. So it's easier to imagine Trump expending political capital, assuming that this is genuinely what he wants, to bring about some kind of a ceasefire in Ukraine. It's not entirely clear how he will go about doing that. There are some plans out there which are respectable, a little bit on the crude side right now, so it would be interesting to see some more detail how they would actually implement those. But even with Trump, there's a question about where that desire for a ceasefire in Ukraine falls in terms of his overall political priorities. Certainly, it is not as high as some of the things that he's hammered on the campaign trail. With the Harris administration, she would probably have to expend more political capital. She would have to figure out a way to sell it to many Democrats who are willing to go as long as it takes with the Zelensky government to win this war, whatever that means. But you can see circumstances in which, for example, an effort potentially behind the scenes to put pressure on both sides in sort of the same way people who are close to Trump have proposed Trump would do. And you can see with the right amount of finesse that working. But of course, with so many different crises out there in the world right now, whoever is in the Oval Office is going to have to choose where he or she is going to put their precious political capital.
And what do you think is the psychology of the U.S. role in Ukraine right now? President Biden has obviously framed this in quite emotional terms. This was a big priority for him, the U.S. role in Europe, but also standing up to Russia. What are if you think through the loss aversion risks in this, what would you say anyone who wants to end this war has to tackle in that regard?
I mean, I think the loss aversion case is pretty clear, which is that, the United States is spending billions and billions of dollars a year. And just like with Afghanistan, under the current strategy, there's no end to that. And in addition, it's created a great deal of political turmoil in the United States itself. We saw this in Congress earlier this year. It eats up important resources at the very top. The amount of time that senior people in the government have to spend on this issue is an often overlooked but really important aspect of the costs that the United States is paying.
On the other hand, the sunk cost fallacy is also real.
The sunk cost fallacy is very real. But this is not to, we shouldn't ignore the reality of the costs that Ukraine is paying, that Europe is paying, and frankly also that the Russian people are paying for this. So regardless of how despicable their leadership may be, there are costs, I should mention, also around the world, obviously, that are the effects that this is having economically. These are all very real costs, and it's fine to pay those costs if you know what you're going to get. But right now, without a picture of what that's going to be, I think that making the case from a loss aversion perspective is doable.
You would have to make the case that the losses that Ukraine might incur, territorial losses or losses to European security or losses to U.S. influence in Europe, are worth it.
Well, if you believe that the U.S. influence would decline more as a consequence of a ceasefire, yes, but I would probably dispute that. And if you believe that European security will be worse off if there's a ceasefire, but I think that's also highly debatable, certainly be worse off than the ideal scenario that many people imagine in their heads. but we have to be pragmatic about the circumstances under which that scenario might actually materialize. After all, the United States is not going to fight a war with Russia directly over Ukraine. It hasn't done it in the past. It's not going to do it in the future.
So related to that is the objective that President Trump, President Biden, President Obama has expressed, which is to get Europeans to do more for their own defense. You might make the case that U.S. bureaucracies have maybe not been the most constructive on that front. Would you agree with that? And do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Bureaucracies, yes, but it's frankly the entire political environment too. So for a long time, presidents, basically every president since the beginning of NATO has wanted, as expressed verbally, that Europeans should be bearing more of the burden, Americans should be bearing less. And yet, the complaint continues because the transatlantic relationship remains lopsided. I think what is not achieved, even by getting greater levels of European defense spending, is solving the strategic insolvency problem for the United States. The United States is now committed to defend more countries than ever before. In its history, it made a lot of these commitments during the Cold War, which is long past, and then made more during the post-Cold War era of American unipolarity, where essentially the animating logic behind taking on more commitments was not so much that the United States was able and willing to defend new countries as that it would never even be a problem. And so now, it's plausible that the United States will actually have to defend some of its allies in Europe or Asia that are close to the borders of an adversary, Russia, China. And that raises immediate questions about whether the United States has the political will to do that, whether its partners do, et cetera. So I think the median position that Donald Trump has taken on European defense has always been Europeans should spend more. And then he has suggested this time on the campaign trail that if a country didn't spend, I think it's 2%, maybe he's talked about 3% also as a new threshold.
I don't think there's a ceiling, really. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, whatever number he wants to come up with, that if they were attacked and they weren't spending enough, they weren't, quote unquote, paying their dues to NATO, which is not how it works, but never mind, it's in his head, that's what matters, then he would not come to their defense. So that's a little bit different from the age-old complaint about burden sharing that starts to get into this territory of burden shifting. Now, to my mind, it's getting interesting, right? It would mean Europe being responsible and capable of defending itself, potentially without the United States, but at least bearing the lion's share of the defense burden when it comes to defending Europe. But I don't actually think that Trump has clearly signaled that that is his strategic objective. In general, he said different things at different moments, but I think that, again, the median position has been that he wants Europeans to spend more, and then in theory, he would be willing to order U.S. troops to come to their defense in a contingency. We can question whether he would in fact do that, but that does seem to be the kind of median position. And it's a fairly
protection racket idea.
Protection racket idea. It's a fairly easy idea for him to talk about. It doesn't necessarily mean implementing difficult changes, which is exactly what we've been talking about. So I think if we're going to talk about really trying to tackle the transatlantic division of labor and solve the U.S. strategic insolvency problem, then that requires a real plan, coordinated action in which the United States would not just be pressuring, but would also be cooperating with its European allies over a period of time so that European allies don't freak out that America suddenly abandoned them wholesale and start either collapsing in on themselves or potentially turning to Russia, some of them, to make a deal. But it means sustaining an effort over a period of time. That also has the advantage of being gradual. It's something that the bureaucracy maybe could get behind, and it doesn't have to lead to the United States leaving NATO or fully withdrawing its forces from the European continent at the end of, let's say, 8-10 years. It could mean the United States moving to a supporting role so that if it does happen that there's a contingency in Europe and for whatever reason the United States is not capable or not politically willing to participate, that Europe could mount a good defense of its own.
There's something to be said for self-sufficiency on Europe's part. I think that would strengthen the transatlantic relationship. I mean, that's sort of at the core of it. And there are also things that the United States could do to help Europe along that path, other than just insisting upon it. I mean, by helping European defense industry, for example,
Yes.
A range of different things that America could do to help Europe become stronger.
Yeah. Yeah, I really don't want to let Europe off the hook here. I think it's mostly on these guys. But since we are talking about U.S. foreign policy, do you think that the crisis of the Ukraine war, the realization maybe that what used to be a very theoretical complaint of unequal U.S. burden sharing is now becoming a real challenge for Americans that might now need to come to the defense of their allies? Is that enough to overcome some of the obstacles that have prevented a change in U.S. position on European defense in the past? So one of these is U.S. defense industrial interests in Europeans continuing to buy American weapons rather than investing in their own defense industries. Going back to, the obstacles you've identified, that is certainly an issue in Congress, who are the target of U.S. defense lobby. Another one, this idea of, again, loss aversion, the idea that the U.S. might lose influence in NATO, in, I think, the main alliance that has allowed the U.S. to exert and display its primacy, if there is a stronger European pillar there. Do you think that the crisis we're seeing right now is enough to overcome some of these obstacles?
I certainly don't. A crisis, as we've said, can always be open to interpretation about what caused it and what the solution is. I think if I were putting money on where U.S. policy would go with another 4 years of Donald Trump, the sort of median outcome, as I see it, would be more pressure on European allies to reach a certain threshold of defense spending, maybe some small drawdowns of U.S. forces from the continent, but continuing to try to sell American weapons to Europe as much as possible. And that looks kind of like, a more exaggerated form of what we saw after Trump's first term. And that merely got us to the point where we're still having the same conversation today. So I think it still takes a systematic plan and a real desire among not just the principals, but also the bureaucracy to make the change happen. And it would require a lot of salesmanship to allies as well as in Washington. I think it is possible. But it would require, making some compromises to make this renegotiation of the transatlantic bargain work. And one of them would absolutely be encouraging Europe to buy European and build its defense industrial base so the politics can work in Europe as well as the United States, although that alone would also make the politics harder here.
I mean, I think you can argue that there is a window of opportunity right now that's been created by the war because it's generated a lot more elite and I think also broader political support for Europe taking defense more seriously than it has in the past. And at the same time, at least for NATO Europe, the threat from Russia is not that high for the time being. That could obviously change 5 or 10 years from now, but right now Russia is tied up in Ukraine. And so that means that there is a period in which Europe could really take on an entirely new role here. The question is whether or not the United States will be willing to step back in the ways that Stephen was just describing and give up, as you say, this sense of leadership, which is a complicated thing. But if America can do that, you could see the kind of strategic change in terms of U.S.-European relations that really is needed when you put the U.S.-Europe relationship in the broader context of all these other crises that we're seeing in the world.
Let's talk about Israel. There's been some speculation that President Harris may end up wishing to do more than the current administration to pressure Israel to bring about a ceasefire with Hamas or expand the sanctions imposed on Israeli settlers. But support for Israel is arguably one of the most entrenched policy positions in U.S. foreign policy. How do you, recommend approaching an issue like this to a president who might want to make some changes?
I would say two things. I would say, obviously, going back to the question of political capital, there is a core question of political capital here. We're talking about a Harris presidency in this case, because I don't think that we would expect President Trump to make any significant changes in terms of U.S. Approach to Israel or the Middle East as a whole, unless it were to go to war with Iran. But there is a real question about whether or not a Harris presidency, potentially if it were two-term presidency, for example, might take the experience of the last year and the very intense sentiments that have been expressed by a significant part of Democratic base as a sign that, it's time for the Democrats to shift their policy on Israel. Even in that case, it would still require the right constellation in Congress, the right strategy with the parts of the bureaucracy that will be resistant to change, and just a general will to spend political capital. If those elements are in place, probably an incremental approach would be best. It's difficult to take the incremental approach, given that this is an ongoing crisis right now, which makes it very, very hard. But I think it is possible, and I think we are seeing among Democrats a much higher degree of support, especially among future generations, as younger people. And so if she might read the tea leaves and say this is the direction that the party is going, and we need to adjust the traditional way in which the United States has approached Israel in particular.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. So one thing she can do is lay down conditions on certain forms of support for Israel early. That will give her more leverage with the government of Israel. They'll know that she'll have another 4 years to go as president, if not 8 years, so they can't just, or the cost would be higher and the risk would be greater to try to, quote unquote, go to war with a President Harris like that. And something else that we found is that because people are resistant to wholesale change, it's often best to present change in less threatening ways that make the change sound more incremental. And I think in this case, we would be talking about realistically incremental change anyway, so that's just honest. So I think, she would want to work out a policy of support for Israel in some ways, such as by supplying Israel with weapons to defend itself against missile and rocket attacks, but put conditions on more offensive military operations, whether those are in Gaza, Lebanon, et cetera, or Iran. So one thing she could do is talk about what the alternative policy would be, a policy of unconditional support. And in this regard, to blunt some of the domestic pressure, she could note how odd it is as a principle to be in favor of just giving billions of dollars of weapons to a foreign government to do with as they like without any conditions. I think she could stick back in the face of America firsters. How is that America first? And in fact, the political right is often making parallel arguments when it comes to Ukraine, that the United States is following the government of Zelensky too much and should be looking out for its own distinct interests. In the conflict, the same principle could apply in the Middle East as well.
Okay, I wanted to talk about China at the end. And I guess my first question here is this even relevant to the China question? Do you see a willingness on either side of the political spectrum in Washington right now to enact major policy change when it comes to the, hard-on China policy that we've seen on both sides?
I mean, it gets to a question that we encountered in the report, which is how do we define strategic change in the first place? I mean, certainly you can imagine various different scenarios for the future of U.S.-China relations. And in fact, we have another big report that we're releasing this week. And in one of those scenarios, the scenario that we focus on in this report, we paint what coexistence between the United States and China might look like. And that may not seem like something that's too radical, but certainly it's very different from some of the scenarios that are on offer out there in Washington today, for example, complete decoupling or outright war. And so we ask in that, what it would take to get there. My own view is that likely a Harris administration would pursue a somewhat similar policy toward China that the Biden administration has pursued, which especially since trying to re-engage over the course of the last 2 years, I think has been the right approach. You might change certain things about it, but the challenges in our relationship with China have primarily come from Congress, actually, rather than from the White House. And we're sort of focused in this report on, how the White House can manage its foreign policy. So the big question is, of course, what a Trump administration policy towards China would look like, because there's a lot of big variables in there. Obviously, enormous amount of hawkishness on China among the Republican Party right now, those who are most vocal on foreign policy issues, but some likelihood that President Trump would, certainly on the tariff side, go awfully hard at China. But then questions about, if there were a crisis over Taiwan, how would a Trump administration really? I think that's a big unknown, how they would actually respond in those questions. So it's a little bit hard to talk about strategic change when it comes to I guess, either of those cases.
Yeah. I mean, the crisis question was my next question on this. We talked earlier about how can you prepare for a crisis as a candidate, as a president. This is one of the issues where crisis seems likely, some sort of crisis between U.S. and China. And we talked earlier about how to remain disciplined in those situations. So is that something that you had in mind when you put out that report, preparing U.S. policymakers to remain disciplined in crisis with China, to not go into conflict?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a benefit of taking a long-term view of these issues, to think about what your long-term objectives are, what's best for, America and, the medium to long run. And that's what we're trying to do in that particular report. And it can be strategic change, or it might feel like strategic change, even though it's actually just holding the line of the current policy.
That goes back to the difficulty of sometimes not acting in a crisis when all the pressures are to act. And,
sure.
And to
it's a really interesting question, what you would do, for example, if there were a crisis over Taiwan and whether or not the American president has options or whether or not there really is only one. And I mean, it's an interesting subject.
Yeah, I think a U.S.-China crisis, very simply could lead the United States and China in two different directions. It could be akin to the Berlin airlift and cement a kind of Cold War rivalry, or it could be more akin to a Cuban Missile Crisis in which ultimately the U.S. and the Soviet Union were scared straight and we saw a shift toward détente. I don't know that a conflict over Taiwan would have that characteristic, especially if the PRC actually mounted a blockade or an invasion, but maybe an incident in the air, at sea, that kind of thing could potentially lead both sides to think carefully about all the costs that would come from getting into an outright conflict. But even just the speculation about, what does a U.S.-China war look like, including over Taiwan, if the next president wants to move things in a direction toward avoidance of conflict, toward competitive coexistence, that's something that they could talk about more openly. It's in the Biden administration's stock language that, of course, we don't want conflict with China, that would be very bad for both sides, and that the United States wants coexistence. But the emphasis has been on increasing, intensifying the competition. And so I think right now, although it seems hard to sort of imagine a fundamental change on U.S. policy toward China, we also shouldn't overstate the sort of coherence of the precision of the consensus that currently exists with respect to China policy. I think there's a spectrum right now of options that U.S. policy falls within, and it's not fully determined where it wants to land, ranging from a kind of competitive coexistence on the one side to strategic competition, which is the centerpiece of the Biden administration's approach, which is not really working towards terms of coexistence, but getting tough without trying to get into conflict or a Cold War. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have something that looks a lot like an outright Cold War that could turn hot and attempt to outwardly contain Chinese influence and so forth. So I think we're right now floating somewhere in the middle with shades toward one direction or the other, and the next president does have the ability to, move that center of gravity towards one side or the other.
The politics of the issue are very important. I mean, it's interesting that China policy hasn't been as big of an issue in the presidential campaign as you might have thought it would be a year ago. And obviously that's because of ongoing events elsewhere in the world. But it's possible that the political context could be different for the next president than it has been for the Biden administration, which has really had to push against this sort of very strong anti-China winds here in Washington just in order to pursue a sensible policy of engagement.
So much more to talk about here. So I hope that we can have you back at some point in the future. But we've come to the point of the show where I ask our guests what book or paper they would recommend to our audiences who would want to better understand this issue. And please don't be embarrassed to just recommend your own thing.
I am embarrassed to do that.
I will then recommend the report that we've talked about a lot in this episode, which is called Strategic Change in U.S. Foreign Policy, and which is co-authored by Chris and Stephen and a bunch of other excellent people. Anything else that you would like to recommend?
So I will put forward a book called Wars of Revelation by Rebecca Listner. And this is a book about how the United States, U.S. policymakers, made grand strategic adjustments as a result of the experiences of engaging in wars. She has case studies looking at the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Persian Gulf War of 1991. So it's quite relevant. It resonates in particular with our finding that crises can do a lot to open up new kinds of possibilities and bring about strategic changes or strategic adjustments. So it's a good book in its own right. I have assigned it for a long time in my classes. And there's a meta point as well. And that
Interesting
is
author also.
Exactly, that she is the Deputy National Security Advisor of Vice President Harris. So I don't know that the book contains clear tea leaves that people can read as to what a President Harris would do, but that shouldn't stop people from trying.
Great recommendation, I think. Chris, you have anything to add?
So, Sophia, I think if for anyone who wants to really get to the root of the question of why the institutional structure that produces U.S. foreign policy doesn't want to change, you have to think about the humans at the core of it. And so for me, learning about prospect theory, Kahneman and Tversky's work in particular, was very useful as a foundation in thinking about why it's so hard to change U.S. foreign policy.
欢迎来到六度解析新闻背后的多维思考，带你洞悉头条背后的世界。在今日华尔街频道的六度解析中，我们将深入探究时事热点，为你揭开新闻背后的真相。在这个信息泛滥、真相难觅的时代，六度解析应运而生。我运用海量数据、人工智能整合以及专家观点，层层剥析每个故事，通过实时背景数据挖掘，确保你获得全面的新闻资讯。然而，我们关注的不仅仅是数据，更重要的是将它们串联起来。我将分析多方视角，揭示隐藏的脉络，为你提供单一媒体常常忽略的背景信息。无论是政治、经济，还是全球事务，我都将为你带来最具洞察力的分析。试想一下，拥有洞悉全局的能力，做出明智的决策，参与有意义的讨论，这就是六度解析带给你的价值。它不仅仅是新闻分析，更是一种赋能的工具。加入今日华尔街的六度解析，共同探索头条背后的故事。你通往深度理解的旅程从这里开始。不要只是阅读新闻，要解码新闻，理解新闻，活出新闻。这一切尽在六度解析。立即订阅，不错过任何真知灼见。因为了解真相仅仅是个开始。